Good evening and welcome. My name is Loretta Lyons. I am the programming librarian at Guilford Free Library. Our talk tonight is on Yale University and the politics of slavery, featuring Bennett Parton. This program is part of an ongoing series co-sponsored by the local initiative, Witness to History, Slavery in Guilford. If you'd like to ask a question at the end of the talk, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Now I'm going to turn it over to Doug Nygren, Chair of Witness to History, Slavery in Guilford, who will be introducing our speaker tonight. Doug?
Thank you, Loretta, and thank you, Guilford Free Library, for hosting this evening's talk. I'd also like to express a special thanks to Bernard Pitterman, John Callio of our team. Bernie was instrumental in finding our speaker, and John designed the poster for the talk, as he has for all of our previous lectures. I'm Doug Nygren, Chair of Witness to History, Slavery in Guilford. Tonight's talk, like the previous ones, is being recorded and can be viewed in a few days on our website, slaveryinguilford.org. Once again, slaveryinguilford.org, one word. You will also be able to find the recording on Guilford Free Library's website. Tonight's talk is in line with our project's purpose, which is to uncover the missing history of slavery in Guilford, examine its legacies, and share with you what we find. Last month in our series, Dr. Ken Minkema of Yale's Jonathan Edwards Center spoke about religion, race, and slavery in colonial New England. We learned how slavery peaked in New England in the mid-18th century, how having a slave was on par with owning a carriage, having a fine tea set, and wearing refined clothes. That persisted until things quickly changed and slavery came to be considered a sin. Our speaker tonight is Bennett Parton, who grew up in Georgia, where he went to college before coming to Yale to do graduate work in American history. His period of interest is the 19th century, with a focus on slavery, abolition, and emancipation. Articles he has written have appeared in the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Like Professor David Blight and Dr. Minkema in our talks before him, Ben is a member of the Yale and Slavery Working Group, which Yale's president charged with investigating the university's historic entanglement with slavery, the slave trade, and abolition. In forming the group, Yale's president, Peter Solovey, wrote, quote, "To understand where we are today and to move forward as a community, we must study the history of our university." End of quote. That history is complex, President Solovey wrote, noting that in its 319-year history, Yale has had many associations, many of them formative, with individuals who actively promoted slavery, anti-Black racism, and other forms of exploitation. We, Yale that is, have a responsibility to explore this history, including its most difficult aspects, end of quote. President Solovey goes on to say, quote, "We cannot ignore our institution's own ties to slavery and racism, and we should take this opportunity to research, understand, analyze, and communicate that history," end of quote. The same could be said for Guilford. To understand where we are today and to move forward, we must study the history of our town, which goes back 382 years. Please join me in welcoming Bennett Parton, whose talk is entitled Yale University and the Politics of Slavery. Ben?
Great, that was a great introduction, thank you. And as Doug said, I'm originally from Georgia, which absolutely makes me a Braves fan, so I apologize if I still seem a little bit bleary-eyed. I'm just now coming from teaching as well, so I'm switching gears a little bit. But nonetheless, I'm really happy to be here, very much grateful for the invitation. And I really appreciate Bernie, Doug, Loretta for inviting me. I think what you guys are doing here is great. I'm very happy to be a part of it. I'll say too, as Doug mentioned, I'm a part of the Yale and Slavery Working Group, the Yale and Slavery Project. That's now about a year old. And we've actually just had a really important milestone for us. Last weekend, we hosted the first Yale and Slavery Conference. I think Yale and Slavery from a historical perspective is the official title. And this was a moment for us to begin to share our work and to start engaging with a wider audience, more so than what we had done previously. And I just want to mention this to say that most all of the sessions are up online. They're on YouTube. You can find them there. And we're also going to be doing more programming in the coming months, and especially in the spring, and quite frankly, for as long as the project takes us. So if it's something you're interested in, stay tuned for that. You're more than welcome to join us for some of those. This particular talk that I'm giving tonight comes out of that work. And it's actually a talk that I've done, a similar talk to one I've done in settings similar to this. And it's titled Yale and the Politics of Slavery, which is really my way of framing Yale's place in the 19th century and framing Yale's place in the story of the coming of the Civil War. But first, before maybe saying too much and going far into the presentation, I just want to take a second to introduce a few people and maybe tell a few stories. And the first person I want to introduce is a man named Amos Beeman. One of the really important things for us in our projects, and one of the important questions we had in doing the research, is finding out who were the important Black abolitionists in the city of New Haven. And that discussion very much begins and ends with Amos Beeman. Beeman was born free right here in Connecticut, I believe in Colchester. His father fought in the Revolutionary War, and that's how he actually gains his freedom. Beeman actually grew up, though, in Middletown. He learned to read because a Wesleyan student was a personal tutor of his, taught him how to read. And he's perhaps best known as the lead pastor of Temple Street African Congregational. And it's a post he held from 1841 to 1856, and that is now Dixwell Congregational here in New Haven. But aside from being a pastor, he was also perhaps New Haven's leading African-American abolitionist. He was at the forefront of Connecticut's suffrage movement, Black suffrage movement, rather. He was a contributor and commenter for a number of important anti-slavery newspapers, including Frederick Douglass's North Star, its later iteration, Frederick Douglass's paper, The Colored American, and the list goes on. On top of that, Beeman was a regular member of what's known as the National Colored Convention Movement, which was a series of conventions held in which prominent free Black leaders came to discuss Black politics and a range of issues. And at one point, he even served as the convention's president. And so the point to make about Beeman is that, yes, he's local to New Haven, but his influence spans the country, quite frankly. I mean, he's a local leader, but he's someone that has national prominence and someone we should definitely remember. And what you can see on the screen is one of the few photos of Beeman, but also you can see some of his scrapbooks, which are available at Beinecke Library. He kept a number of folios of scrapbooks where he clipped articles he had written, articles that he liked, letters from himself, from that others had written to him. It's really a trove of information to read through. And again, they were at Dixwell Congregational, now they're at Beinecke, and anyone can go and view them. There are also a number of letters in there from him to Douglass where they're having conversations, which I think underscores just how important he was and how prominent he was as an African-American leader. The next person that deserves mentioning is James C. Pennington. Unlike Beeman, Pennington was born a slave in Maryland. And at some point, I think around age 18, he actually managed to escape. And remarkably, we actually have the runaway slave ad that his master put in the newspaper, trying to find him. You can find it online. At any rate, he winds up in New York City, particularly in Brooklyn. While there, he finds religion, he learns to read. He also joins the church. And he gets really involved with the Colored Convention movement, which I just mentioned. He also becomes friends with a really important person in his life and a really important person in the city of New Haven named Simeon Jocelyn. Jocelyn was a local abolitionist in New Haven. In 1831, he tried to create what in effect would have been the first HBCU in New Haven, but it's voted down. And in the aftermath of that, his house is actually attacked by anti-abolitionist mobs, and he's driven out of New Haven down to Brooklyn, and that's where he meets James C. Pennington. But Pennington has desires to go on to divinity school. He wants to be a pastor. So Jocelyn sponsors and very much becomes sort of a patron of Pennington, helps him get into the Yale Divinity School. I think he gives him a house here to live in. and it very much becomes a real mentor to him in a lot of ways. The thing about Pennington's time at Yale, though, is that he's never actually a student, because Connecticut laws at the time didn't actually allow out-of-state African-American students to go to Connecticut colleges. He can only audit the classes. He's not formally a student. He can't even access the library. Can't access any of the student services. And he would later somewhat acrimoniously describe his time at Yale as his visitorship. He only stays at Yale for a couple of years, and at some point he leaves and relocates to Hartford. And it's while he's here that he becomes as involved as ever in the ongoing anti-slavery movement. Like Beeman, he becomes a regular contributor and writer for a host of African-American newspapers, anti-slavery newspapers. He gets involved in a sort of Back to Africa movement. As I said, he's a regular member of the Colored Convention movement. And he would later help recruit Black soldiers in the Civil War. And it's in this period, too, that he writes what becomes his personal narrative, his memoir, which you can see on the screen, Fugitive of Blacksmith. It's his own fugitive slave narrative. And also, he would also write what is arguably the very first history of African Americans. He wrote a history of African Americans that very few are floating around, but you can actually find them online. And so I think the point about Pennington is very much similar to the one about Beeman, which is he is someone who has national stature, nationally known, and is a very important member, not just of the Connecticut's anti-slavery movement, but the anti-slavery movement writ large. Oops, let me go back. I also want to take a second to talk about a couple of white abolitionists who have really interesting stories and stories that intersect with Yale. And the first person I want to talk about is this guy. His name's Charles T. Torrey. You can see an image of him there on the screen. Torrey was a student at Yale in the early 1830s. And like a lot of students of his era, he sort of gets swept up in the Second Great Awakening, which is happening. He finds religion. He becomes incredibly religious. He also becomes an abolitionist. He's an early colleague, mentee of William Lloyd Garrison, who would become one of, if not the most important abolitionist in the country. He's based out of Boston. He would edit the newspaper The Liberator. And for the longest time, he was very much an acolyte and a follower of Garrison, but they would eventually have a falling out. Garrison was known for being a pacifist. He was known for attacking the church, and he was known for not wanting to get involved in politics. Torrey wanted a much more forceful and more active position. And so he would eventually have a falling out with Garrison, which was something that was fairly common. He had a tendency to rankle some of his friends, Frederick Douglass being a famous example. And so Torrey would set up a rival abolitionist organization in New England. But at some point, Torrey actually moves south. He moves to the Washington, D.C. area and becomes quite possibly, behind Harriet Tubman, the most prolific conductor in the history of the Underground Railroad. He leads hundreds, perhaps, enslaved people to freedom, again, being based out of DC, but eventually he's caught. He's tried, he's in prison. He actually dies in prison. And after his death, he very much becomes a martyr for the wider anti-slavery movement. Folks like William Lloyd Garrison and others would later write back and talk about Charles Torrey as a martyr. Williams Still, who was the father of the Underground Railroad, a free African-American out of Philadelphia, he would write about Charles Torrey as a martyr, as an inspiration. He would devote a whole section of his history of the Underground Railroad to Torrey. And then later, John Brown would actually cite Torrey as well as an inspiration, as someone that very much inspired him, and someone that he saw as sort of a compatriot. And so again, the idea here is that Charles Torrey was very much a martyr for the movement. You can say the same about the next person I want to talk about, who is Reuben Crandall. But I just want to say right off the bat that the person that's pictured here on the slide is not Reuben Crandall. I'll explain who this is in a second. There are no that I could find images of Crandall. But like Torrey, Crandall's a student at Yale early in the 1830s. Similar kind of story. He gets swept up in the Second Great Awakening, some of the religious movements that are happening in New England at the time. and he commits himself to the church, but also commits himself to abolition. I should say too, Crandall has maybe a perhaps better known sister named Prudence Crandall, who lived in Hartford. She ran a school for girls in the Hartford area. And in the 1830s, mid 1830s, she opens up her school to Black schoolgirls. As a result, she's actually driven out of New Haven from anti-abolition mobs. But like his sister Prudence, Reuben is someone who's a part of this wider anti-slavery coalition. He spent some time at Yale in the 1830s before moving on. He moves to New York for a bit and actually becomes a botanist. And he would later move to Washington, D.C. And set up a botany shop in what's now the Georgetown area of Washington, D.C. And while there, police suspect him of maybe of having anti-slavery pamphlets. They barge into his shop. They find the pamphlets they're looking for. He's got a plethora of abolitionist and anti-slavery material. And they arrest him on charges of trying to incite a riot. The idea was that he was going to distribute these and try to incite slaves in the DC area, Maryland area, elsewhere into rebellion. And he's charged with this crime. He's put on trial, and the attorney general or the district attorney of DC elects to prosecute him. And that's who this person is in the image. This is actually Francis Scott Key. Who knew that aside from being an amateur poet, Francis Scott Key was also a really important lawyer and someone who originally had expressed reformist ideas around slavery. He considered himself an anti-slavery reformer. But when pressed by abolitionists like folks like Crandall, he actually becomes a fervent anti-abolitionist and becomes much more conservative and much more pro-slavery in his sort of older age in his position as Attorney General. So he elects to prosecute Crandall, and he famously loses the case. He can never actually tie Crandall and his pamphlets to an intent to distribute. And this is one of his swan songs. This is one of the last things Key does in his career. He's not publicly humiliated, but his reputation certainly takes a hit. And Crandall, it's a very similar story to Charles Torrey. He would be released from prison, but he had contracted tuberculosis in prison. And I think it's 2 months after he's released, he would also die. And similar to Torrey, he very much becomes a martyr for the wider anti-slavery movement. Abolitionists would write back about the Crandall case, see it as a milestone for them, and write back in homage of Crandall. I should say, though, we've talked about a couple of somewhat exceptional cases of abolitionists and folks who are part of a wider anti-slavery coalition who had ties to Yale. But the point is that they're very much the exception and not the norm. In the 1830s and 1840s, we can't really think of anti-slavery as being formalized at Yale in any certain sense. And we know that in part because of this guy, Andrew Dixon White. He was a student at Yale in the 1840s. He was a particular mentee of the Yale president at the time, someone who I'll talk about in a moment. And he writes in his autobiography that at the time, the consensus on campus was doing anything that could be done to compromise on the slavery issue. And there was no one, there was no strong anti-slavery feeling on campus, except for there were two exceptions that he mentioned. One of them was his mentor, Theodore Dwight Woolsey. Woolsey's somewhat of an interesting character at Yale. He becomes president in the 1840s. Check my notes on that. He becomes president in the 1840s, and as one of my colleagues, Judy Schiff, has written, he becomes quite possibly one of the most transformational presidents in Yale's history. He's the president here throughout from 1846 to 1871. So he was the president here throughout the entire Civil War period. And he's really the person who's behind taking Yale, not as sort of a parochial college, it was a national university at the time, but a very religious oriented school to a much more modern university. Woolsey himself was someone who specialized in international law. He, I think, was the first president not to be a pastor, I believe that's correct. And so you can begin to see him moving Yale into much more sort of modern standing. Woolsey was always anti-slavery to some degree. In the 1820s, he joins an African American colonization society. He joins an African Improvement Society. He joins an early anti-slavery society. And so he was always an anti-slavery reformer of some stripe. But throughout the 1840s and 1850s, he would really have an evolution to where he went from being someone who was sort of moderately anti-slavery, moderately an abolitionist, to being someone who was fervently anti-slavery and someone who was willing to speak up on and express his anti-slavery views. Particularly in the 1850s, he would found a newspaper, or excuse me, a magazine known as the New Englander, where he wrote several columns and essays where he takes the pro-slavery position to task. And it's in this magazine that he begins to express a number of his sort of changing views and his much more fervent stance on abolition. He would also have a lengthy correspondence with a guy named Francis Lieber, who at the time was probably the most important political scientist of the 19th century. He's someone who wrote what was known as Lieber's Code, which is kind of a laws of war, which became kind of the intellectual foundation for many of the rules and sort of ideas about war that the Civil War was later fought on. Lieber himself was German, I believe, but nonetheless, he was teaching at the time at South Carolina College, now the University of South Carolina. And he had written a book or written a few things that expressed some sort of pro-slavery view. And Dwight Woolsey writes a series of letters to Lieber and a series of book reviews that begin to really take him to task for his positions and tear apart his arguments. And so this is one of the moments where we can see Woolsey begin to evolve into his much more fervent, like I said, anti-slavery position. The other person that Andrew Dixon White mentions as being exception to the norm, let me go back, is Leonard Bacon. Leonard Bacon and Woolsey were old friends. Like Woolsey, Bacon was a part of the Colonization Society, which wasn't expressly anti-slavery, but nonetheless, a lot of anti-slavery reformers in the 1820s found a home there. He was also a part of a African American Improvement Society in New Haven, and he would also be a part of this small anti-slavery society that existed along in New Haven that Woolsey was also a member of. And like Woolsey, Bacon has a real personal evolution. In the early 1820s, he was someone who didn't speak very favorably of people like Garrison or Charles Torrey, these much more avid abolitionists. He's someone who was anti-slavery in posture, but he was not really affiliated with any sort of national anti-slavery society. But his position begins to change. Perhaps most famously, in 1848, he writes a pamphlet that you can see on the screen here, Slavery and Occasional Essays, where he begins to lay out his own views. He steers a somewhat moderate course on slavery, again, still anti-slavery, but much more moderate than, say, someone like Garrison. But the reason I mention this particular set of essays is because not only can we begin to see Bacon evolve in his thinking and adopt a much more sort of fervent anti-slavery position than he had before, but supposedly this is a collection of essays that Abraham Lincoln found particularly appealing. He would say this was his sort of education on the slavery issue. And I think you can make an argument that the Lincoln you see in the Frederick Douglass debates, where he's debating Stephen Douglas and they're arguing over slavery, very much comes out of this collection of essays. And so it's very important and one of the real moments where we can see Bacon begin to evolve and begin to move. But if both Woolsey and Bacon are somewhat moderated in their sort of anti-slavery position in the 1840s and early 50s, and when I say that, I mean there are people who are anti-slavery of a kind of anti-slavery persuasion, but not really formally involved in a wider movement or a wider protest movement. That all changes in 1854. They each have what you can kind of think of maybe as a road to Damascus moment. And it happens because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And I'll say too that we found in our research, we found this is true for people like Bacon and Woolsey, but it's also true for folks like Benjamin Silliman, who was a really important Yale faculty member, someone who has a college named after him. It also seems to be true for most folks in the wider New Haven area as well. And I can't help but think this is somewhat odd, right? This is, a piece of legislation. It has to do with creating the states of Kansas and Nebraska, which seems, innocuous enough. Moreover, we have spirited debates over legislation, but how much do we really know is in, say, the infrastructure bill or, whatever. But nonetheless, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is a huge issue because what it basically did was it created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, and it allowed the people of each state to decide whether or not those states or those eventual states would be free or slave states. It was based on this notion of popular sovereignty. And the reason that this is such an important flashpoint for folks like Woolsey and Bacon is because it basically tells them that the idea of compromise is dead. You see, in adopting the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it basically nullifies what was the Missouri Compromise, which people had considered sort of something that was sacred, something that had always been a part of American life. The Missouri Compromise happened in 1820, and basically what it did was it outlawed slavery north of the bottom of Missouri, which you can see, the 3630 parallel, which you can see on the image there. And so the Kansas-Nebraska Act nullifies that after being in existence for several decades. It also reopens the Compromise of 1850, which is a much more recent compromise. The Compromise of 1850 had been about slavery's expansion into the Western territories, what's now New Mexico, Arizona, and Southern California. And at the time, they basically tabled the issue of whether or not popular sovereignty would be sort of the basis for the new state constitutions in those territories. And they tabled that issue. But now that Kansas-Nebraska the Act has been passed, these states get to decide whether or not they want to be free or slave states. That reopens the question of the Compromise of 1850. So folks like Woolsey sees this as the idea of compromise being dead. They also see this as a sign of Southern aggression. They think that Southerners are the ones that are behind this, and that no matter what, Southerners are going to try to expand slavery into the far north. And if not Kansas, Nebraska, then maybe eventually they'll have their way and get it, make it legal to hold slaves in places like Iowa, Illinois, elsewhere. So this is when we see Woolsey in particular become much more involved in a wider anti-slavery debate. It's also the moment we begin to see anti-slavery become somewhat formalized and somewhat the de facto position on campus. Woolsey himself would write a series of public letters and memos. He would write one called the Nebraska Remonstrance that he signs on with several university faculty and presidents, including the president of Harvard at the time, that denounces what's happening with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He would write another known as the Connecticut Memorial and sign on to it, which was a number of local prominent Connecticut officials that are doing the same thing. They're denouncing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He would also take part in a what was known as a Bible and Rifles for Kansas meeting here in New Haven. It's held in North Church, right here on the green. And what it is a meeting of prominent members of New Haven, where they get together, and basically what they do is they raise money to buy guns to send to Kansas to be used in the emerging Civil War in Kansas. And what you can actually see on the screen, I'm not sure if you can see it that well, but what happens in this particular magazine article is Professor Benjamin Silliman, who again I said is a really important faculty member at Yale. He's a geologist in training, might be one of the most important scientists in the US at the time. He has a college named after him on campus now. He actually looks up in the audience and he gets I think it's the sophomore, junior, and senior classes of Yale to all pledge money to buy guns to be sent to Kansas. And so again, this is a really important moment for Woolsey's own personal, I should say, Woolsey was in attendance. He was in the audience at this time. And so this becomes a really important moment for his own evolution, but it's also a really important moment that we can begin to see anti-slavery become, again, a de facto position, sort of in New Haven more broadly, but specifically on campus. But if this is what the anti-slavery coalition on campus is doing, there is also a Southern response. And I should say, their response is not just to what happens after Kansas, Nebraska, but what happens after Kansas, Nebraska is an exacerbation of some of what's been happening on campus to begin with. There are critical debates over speech, which ring somewhat familiar with what we're dealing with now, I suppose. For example, Southern students broke out in protest over anti-slavery and abolitionist commencement speakers. There was an ongoing message from Southern students here at Yale to the administration to remain what they described as being neutral or national in their orientation, which meant not adopting an anti-slavery position. Things would get so bad that by the end of the 1850s, largely in response to Yale inviting, in 1857, inviting Charles Sumner to give a commencement address. Sumner can't actually do it because he'd just been beaten over the head by a fellow congressman and has to go convalesce in Europe. And so Wendell Phillips, who's an even more radical abolitionist, comes and gives a commencement address in his place. In response, Southerners erupt in protest, and they begin demanding that Yale change and organizing a movement to try to withdraw Southern students from the college. And they begin to threaten that if Yale doesn't reform itself, reform the way it talks about slavery, then eventually all these planters' sons, all these planters are going to withdraw their sons and withhold essentially their patronage from the university. But of course, the rest, as they say, is history. And so we know exactly where the story ends, and it ends in the Civil War. And so with that, that basically concludes my talk, and I think I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you, Ben. We'll give everyone a minute. If you do have a question, if you would type it in the Q&A, that would be great. Well, we're waiting. Ben, maybe you could talk a little bit about, you had talked about Leonard Bacon kind of changing his positions around 1848. Is there any evidence, or what started that evolution or that change?
Yeah. The first thing I'll say is that Bacon's a really kind of complicated character in that in the early 1830s, the wider anti-slavery coalition sort of revolves around the idea of colonization in an organization known as the American Colonization Society, which was a gradualist organization who wanted to enact emancipation, but only if emancipation came with the relocation of enslaved people to Africa or somewhere beyond the US. The ACS was a really prominent organization in the 1810s, 1820s, 1830s. It was led mostly by like Upper South Southern slaveholders. Folks like Francis Scott Key was a member, for example. And it was explicitly racist, gradualist. It was not immediatist. And Silliman, as being kind of a reformer, this is his entry point into anti-slavery politics. The problem is Black abolitionists in particular inveigh against colonization from the very beginning. They think this is the worst thing. They think the idea of leaving the US is not a good idea, something they don't want to do. They also sort of see through the scheme, and they see the underlying racism that's a part of the ACS. And what happens in 1833, William Lloyd Garrison and others, folks who were originally colonizationists, they break apart and they form the American Anti-Slavery Society, which is an immediatist organization that's interracial and is dedicated to the immediate end of slavery. And it's a little long-winded answer, but Bacon's kind of problem is he never can sort of leave this idea of colonization, right? He's sort of slow to evolve, slow to adopt the much more active, much more immediatist position. And he's still trying to find sort of a gradualist, moderate route. But he does eventually evolve. And I think the point that he evolves most fully comes in 1854. But nonetheless, in New Haven, we have the attempted creation of a college for colored youth that gets voted down. It sparks anti-abolition mobs throughout the city. There's also the Amistad story, Amistad case that happens in 1838 and 1840. And two, there's a new anti-slavery political party that's on the scene. The anti-slavery movement is, at this point in the 1840s, about 25 years old. And so I think his sort of shift in the 1840s is much more gradual, and it's kind of the culmination of seeing the movement evolve as well. And so that's a very long-winded answer, but I think his evolution is truly an evolution, that it's sort of slower. There's an accretion of witnessing things that's happening around him.
So he followed, but maybe didn't lead.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to describe it.
Okay, here's the question, and I think that, or could you talk about the slave state students matriculating at Yale during the Civil War?
Yeah, that's great. I'm very happy that someone asked that, because so we've actually been able to find a list of Southern students, or excuse me, Yale students who fought for the Confederacy. We've been able to put together a really great resource that lists them all. One of the really interesting things that we find is that the rates of Southern students attending Yale actually declines fairly steeply in the 1850s. This is something we had seen referenced in various books, but we also have data that, at least for the most part, bears that out. And it's absolutely true that by the time the Civil War begins, there are very few Southern students at Yale, and most of them, very few of them at least, actually finish. They all end up leaving. But Yale had quite a few Southerners, I should say too, that New Haven itself was often thought of to be a Southern city. And I say that because New Haven had a large horse and buggy and carriage industry, which every prominent planter in the South needed. So they would come usually once a year to New Haven, and they would fit out their carriages. They would get their carriage, they'd get all of the accessories to go along with it. And so New Haven had extensive economic ties to the South. New Haven was also supposedly, in part because of this reason, considered a Southern resort town. Southerners would come up here in the summer to beat the heat. They would hang out in what is now Worcester Square along Water Street, right along the water. And so that's one of the reasons there is such a real connection of Southern students who come to Yale throughout much of the 19th century. So the connections there are really close, but we do see a gradual waning of Southern students throughout the 1850s.
Thank you. So this is another question about students from Joan Rawlings. Could you talk a little bit more about student opinions and how much were students involved?
Yeah, that's great. That's something we haven't been able to find a whole lot about. One of the next phases for us is digging into student diaries and really trying to find this find this story and find exactly what students were thinking. We know a little bit about the faculty because they tended to write a lot and leave their letters with Yale, so it's kind of there. Students would leave Yale, go somewhere else, and leave their letters, if they left any at all, in their own local state archives. So they're a little bit harder to actually find for us. But nonetheless, we do have a group of student diaries and letters that in the next phase of the project, that's one of the questions that we have. That being said, we know anecdotally, and we've seen it referenced, that there was intense debate at various times amongst students surrounding the issue of slavery. We know it came up especially in the 1850s over questions of commencement speakers and who would be allowed. And we also know that oftentimes there would be students sort of clashing and having like serious debates over the issue of slavery on campus. And so that doesn't really answer the question, but the best thing I can maybe offer is like stay tuned, because that's one of the big questions for the next phase of the project.
And then to broaden that question out, Larry Rizzolo is asking, what was Yale's influence on opinions in the greater New Haven community? Which also might be difficult to document, I guess.
Yeah, I think it is somewhat difficult to document, but one of the positions that we've taken on the project is operating from a position that, especially in the 19th century, what is New Haven, what is Yale, the lines are very blurred. In part because most of the prominent judges, politicians, folks in New Haven were all Yale alumni. Many of them came from old New Haven families. And we know, for example, that in the case of the 1831 college that was attempting to be built, there was a contingent of folks who had founded Yale Law School who actually spoke up at a city meeting and led a vote that went 700-4 opposing the college. They led basically a group who killed the college, basically. And so there's a moment where we can really see this blurring of lines between town and gown happen. And so how much did Yale influence the wider New Haven community? I think quite a bit, in part because the lines were so porous between what was Yale and what is New Haven.
Great. And then one last question from Bernie Pitterman. Do you know how the Yale community reacted to John Brown's raid?
Yeah, great. Hey, Bernie, good to hear from you. I don't actually know all that much. That's a really good question and something I think we can maybe find out, but that's something that hasn't really come up just yet.
Okay, a few more questions if you have, if we can shift in. Shifting gears from, let's see, I'm gonna move on to this. Did Yale own slaves?
That's a great question. So we don't know about the university itself owning enslaved people, but the project, we have been able to uncover that a number of early Yale founders were themselves slaveholders. We've uncovered a couple of presidents who owned enslaved people. And so yeah, certainly important, prominent Yale members of the Yale administration did. The university itself, as far as we can tell, didn't. I should say too that there is ongoing work being done right now on the part of the project to try to figure out if any Southern students actually brought enslaved people to campus. We know that Edward Boucher's father, Edward Boucher is the first African-American to earn a PhD here at Yale, his father arrived in New Haven. Supposedly, he was an enslaved person to a South Carolinian who comes to campus as a student in the early 19th century, and that's how the Boucher family arrives. But that's the only case so far that we've been able to come up with. But nonetheless, this question of whether or not enslaved people came to Yale with Southern students is an ongoing question that we're also really interested in.
A question from Leslie Hay. Were endowments and donations to Yale affected or withdrawn during this period?
Not to my knowledge. I think the idea behind Southerners threatening to withdraw their patronage, meaning they pull their sons out of college, was sort of a form of financial reprisal. But so far as I know, at the time, there was no sort of attack on the endowment, I suppose, or the endowment wasn't involved here. And in fact, I think at the time, most of Yale's funding came from much more local sources.
Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have time for now. So I want to thank you so much, Ben, for your time and this very interesting talk. I know you were up very late last night watching watching your team win. So I want to thank Doug and everyone else for attending. And if you have questions that were not answered tonight, you can email them to me at the library, and I can forward them on to your to the speaker. So thanks very much, everyone. Have a good night.
Yeah, thank you.